Starting a new job can be overwhelming, especially when you're starting a brand new life as well. But what happens when you want to escape the same old? You want to escape the people you used to work with, only to realize that your new job in the middle of nowhere might involve unspeakable evil you've never even imagined.
What's that? You want to be scared? Come with me. You will experience tales of horror, ghosts, and death. It is not recommended for the weak at heart. Listen in the dark. It's more fun that way. This is Weekly Spooky.
Hello, my spookies. It's Wednesday, and you know what that means. It's time for a little spooky in your weekly. I'm your host and narrator, Enrique Couto, and I have a really fun story for you tonight. And not only that, it's submitted by a longtime listener. The story, it slaps hard. Not to use too much kid vernacular, but I loved it, and I know you will too. But before we get to the terrifying tale of the evening, I just want to say thank you so much for listening to the program. We're in the dead of summer, and I do mean dead, and you all listening are the diehards, the people who need their spooky every single week, even when Halloween is pretty far in the rearview mirror. Of course, if you're listening to this, you know that Halloween is a way of life, and I thank you for joining me. So, get yourself ready. Make sure you're subscribed on your favorite podcasting app, and if you want to help us out just a little bit, why not go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a 5-star rating? That way, fellow spookies can see that rating and know they're in the right place, and it's time to join up with their brethren. And speaking of brethren, we have a brand new episode of Cutting Deep into Horror dropping right here at Weekly Spooky on Friday, featuring myself and Rachel Rodolphe talking about the horror film Barbarian from last year. And it's a great conversation about a very scary movie that you can watch right now on Max if you haven't already. It's a great show, so make sure you don't miss it this Friday. But now, my spookies, it's time we head way out to the desert, to a little town called Black Springs. We'll be getting off on that highway exit after we hear a quick word from our very friendly sponsors. Welcome to Black Springs by Bill Spears. The reflective green sign said, "Now entering Black Springs, Texas. Population 1,432. Sheriff Andy Barnes, a short man, slightly overweight with a gray goatee, was driving the marked Samuel County Sheriff pickup, and his new deputy, Sherry Davis, was in the passenger seat. Sherry was considerably younger, not even 30. She had light mocha skin and straight hair. It was Sherry's first day on the job. She was fired from Dallas PD months before when she shot a man in the line of duty. The cable news started running her story, and she was fired and unable to find a job anywhere else. Sheriff Barnes had served in the Marines with Sherry's father and reached out to him when he saw Sherry on the news. Sheriff Barnes himself was having trouble filling a deputy position because no one really wanted to move out to the middle of nowhere, and he was sure that Sherry was having trouble finding a job herself and wouldn't be able to turn him down when he offered. Sherry needed a job, so she took the position as deputy in Samuel County. She had many apprehensions, though. The biggest being there was no way that the people in a middle-of-nowhere Texas county had ever seen anything stranger than a black lady with a badge. The pickup was silent, Sherry wasn't sure how she was even going to relate to Sheriff Barnes. He was a white man in his 70s and had been the sheriff of this county for over 35 years. Back then, the methods of law enforcement in Texas were a little different. Sherry was sure that it was these methods that left towns like Black Springs with a very low black population. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of things Barnes did back then, and if he still used some of those methods now. Sheriff Barnes's demeanor, on the other hand, was completely different. He would smile and occasionally point at something, telling Sherry about what he was pointing at. "That there is the Karankawa Critter Mart. The barbecue is trash and only passers through ever eat there," he said, pointing to a small store with a Sasquatch silhouette outside. "That's the Bald Mound. Comanche claimed it was haunted. Most people stay clear of it because just being near it will put a chill down most folks' spine." When he pointed at a large hill with an abandoned-looking house built into the side, he said, "During the summer and dove season, travelers stay out here." He then pointed at a state campground across the highway from Fort Samuels, a state-run cavalry fort, saying, "That's the state campground." The radio began to static. "SO to 101. It was Ann, the dispatcher, calling to Sheriff Barnes. "This is 101, Sheriff Barnes answered. Dispatch continued. "Father Ortega called and said he needs you at the Catholic Church." 10-4, Sheriff Barnes answered. Barnes then turned on the lights and sirens, turned the vehicle around, and began speeding into town. Sherry looked at Barnes, bewildered. "She didn't say it was an emergency. Why the hurry?" "If it's Ortega, it's an emergency." It took the pickup close to 5 minutes to speed from the north side of the town of Black Springs to the Catholic Church, located on the outskirts of the east side of town. The 5 minutes were spent in even more silence as Sherry wondered what could be at this church and why the sheriff was in a rush to get there. The sun was beginning to set in the late September horizon when the pickup stopped in the gravel parking lot. The church was not lavish at all. It was just a small building with a small steeple, white siding, and a statue of the Virgin Mary out front. It could easily be overlooked. Sheriff Barnes stopped the engine, then turned to Sherry. "I didn't want to get your feet wet this fast, but you're going to see some stuff in here. Some weird stuff. I want you to tell me right now that you are just going to keep your mouth shut until we're out of here. Then I'll answer any question you have." Sherry was taken aback. This old white guy was telling her to keep her mouth shut. She had been through that before with her last chief, immediately before he gave a press conference that threw her under the bus. "What the hell are you talking about?" Sherry responded. "We don't have time right now. Just follow me and keep your mouth shut," Barnes answered before getting out of the pickup. He walked to the concrete slab that served as a porch for the church, then turned around and looked at the truck where Sherry still sat. Sherry inhaled deeply, then exhaled, shook her head slightly, and opened the door to join Barnes on the concrete slab. What else could she do? She was 29 years old, and this was her last chance to make something of herself in this career. Barnes carefully opened the door, little more than a crack, and shouted Ortega's name as he did. A voice came from inside the church. "I'm here! Come in!" Barnes opened the door the rest of the way. A short Hispanic priest in his mid-50s stood on the other side of the door. The priest's right hand was clutching his rosary to his chest, and his left hand was holding a blood-spattered rag to his left cheek. "How bad did she get you?" Barnes asked the priest. The priest removed the rag and showed 4 cuts, like claw marks on his cheek. He then looked past Barnes at Sherry. "Who's she?" "This is Sherry. She's my new deputy. Sherry, this is Father Ortega." "Are you sure it's okay for her to be here?" "She's going to have to learn about this sometime," Barnes replied. "So, is Shine still in the basement?" "Yeah, I got the door locked before she got to it." "Well, let's put her back up then." Barnes led the way to the sturdy wooden door at the back of the sanctuary. Ortega, still clutching the rag to his cheek, followed behind Barnes. Sherry trailed behind as well. She felt chills like she had never felt before. It was like there was something ghostly in the air of that church that she'd never encountered before. She had so many questions, but kept them to herself, keeping in mind that Barnes promised to answer anything she had to ask afterward. When Barnes reached the door, he pulled a key out of his pocket and began to unlock it. This was another question added to Sherry's list. Why did Barnes have a key to this door? Sheriffs usually don't have keys to the back rooms of churches. When he opened the door, Sherry saw that the doorway didn't lead to a back room. It led to a stone staircase, leading downward. Barnes led the way down. Sherry followed Ortega. Yes, she had a feeling of dread coursing through her, and a feeling that she should turn around and leave. But more than the fear, she had curiosity. What was at the bottom of the steps that Barnes and Ortega only referred to as she? Whatever it was, it left those 4 cuts on Ortega's cheek. Was it a wild animal? She had been told that people in small towns like this kept strange pets like bobcats. When Sherry got to the bottom of the steps, she found what lay in the basement was not a bobcat or any other kind of wild animal. It was a preteen Native American girl in a white dress that had copper-colored bloodstains on it. The girl was hiding her face in her folded arms. "Oh, hell no!" Sherry said as she turned back to the stairs and ran back up into the sanctuary of the church. Barnes looked at Ortega and nudged his head towards the door. Barnes and Ortega left the basement, following Sherry to the sanctuary. Sherry was pacing back and forth with her hands on the sides of her head. She didn't even look up to acknowledge Barnes and Ortega when they walked up and through the doorway, Ortega turning back to the door, closing it and locking it. "What the hell are you two involved in?" Sherry spoke more like she was talking to herself than to Barnes and Ortega. "There's a little native girl in a blood-spattered dress in that basement. This is some kind of human trafficking stuff. I'm gonna have to call the Texas Rangers." "Just slow down and think for a second, Sherry," Barnes said calmly. "If this were human trafficking, why the hell would I show you? You just gotta trust me that this isn't what it looks like. I'll be happy to explain it all once we get her back in the restraints." "You expect me to believe this isn't human trafficking when you're talking about putting a little girl in restraints?" "We really don't have time. You just gotta trust me that Shine isn't a little girl, no matter what she looks like." Sherry closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and held her breath for a moment, contemplating what was the worst that could happen to her if she went back into that basement. She was already lucky to not be in jail over the shooting and Dallas PD going with the media narrative and making her out as guilty. Now she could be getting involved with human trafficking. But Barnes was right. If he were up to something illegal, he wouldn't show her after only knowing her for a week. "Okay," Sherry said, against her better judgment. Barnes turned, unlocked the door again, and went back down the stairs. Ortega and Sherry followed him. When they reached the bottom, Barnes made his way toward the native girl and spoke in a calm voice. "Shine, it's me, Andy. I saw what you did to Ortega. We're not mad, we just want to put you back on the bed where everybody is safe." When Barnes was about 2 feet from the girl, she raised her head. She was wearing a sinister grin, and her eyes were solid black. "Andy Barnes, so nice of you to come and visit me again. How's the arm?" Her voice was guttural and evil. Sherry couldn't believe what she was seeing or hearing, and she couldn't let her mind settle on this being true. There had to be some kind of trickery involved. "It healed just fine," Barnes answered. The girl stared at him. Well, staring at him is an understatement. The girl was staring into him. "You told your wife you slipped and fell trying to get a cow off the road and hit into a fence. You still can't bring yourself to tell her about me. I'll chew it off tonight. Let's see you come up with a lie to explain that." The girl then lunged at Barnes's right arm, latching onto it with her arms wrapped around, then dug her teeth in too. Barnes let out a howl of pain. Sherry took a step back, startled. This couldn't be real. There was no way a little girl could leap from a sitting position into the air and latch onto him, biting an arm like that. There had to be some way to explain this. Sherry's brain raced, trying to make sense of it all. "Get her off me!" Sherry snapped out of her confusion and ran to Barnes and the girl. Training began taking precedence over confusion. Sherry used one hand to pull on the girl's chin, then used the finger and thumb of her other hand to pinch the girl's nose. This should cause the girl to run out of breath and open her mouth. Ortega joined Sherry and grabbed the girl's arms, trying to unwrap them. It took several minutes, but Ortega and Sherry were able to remove the girl's grip on Barnes. Sherry fell backward as the girl let go. She landed on top of Sherry, their faces no more than a foot away from each other. "You," the girl said as she straddled Sherry, pinning her arms to the ground. "You are different than these two. You're a murderer. These two are only liars and adulterers." "I'm not a murderer," Sherry fired back. She was trying to push the girl off, but she was too strong. This shouldn't have been possible. The girl couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds. "You killed that boy." "I did what I had to do." Barnes and Ortega, each of them grabbing one of the girl's arms, pulled her off of Sherry. The girl broke their grip and scurried under the metal-framed bed that was in the corner of the room. Ortega moved close to Sherry and whispered, "The demon lies to throw you off balance. Don't believe what it says." "Demon?" Sherry looked at Barnes. "What is going on?" "I told you Shine wasn't a little girl." "But you didn't tell me she was a demon. Would you have believed me? I thought it was best you just see for yourself." "Now that I've seen, what the hell are we going to do about it?" "Get her back on that bed and in the restraints." "That sounds a lot easier than it's going to be." "Nah, we just got to get the bed out of the way, grab her arms, and let Ortega do his mumbo-jumbo while we put her on the bed and attach the restraints." That plan sounded simple enough, so Sherry said, "Let's do it." Sherry moved to the bed, and Barnes followed. They pulled the bed out of the way, and the girl clung to the wall, crawling up it like an insect. Sherry was not expecting this. She was taken aback. Barnes looked as though he had been in this position before and didn't miss a beat in grabbing the girl's arm. She just kept climbing. Barnes looked at Sherry. "Well, grab her arm. You don't want her getting on the ceiling. It's hell getting her off of there." Sherry reached for the girl, but the girl turned her head and bit Sherry's hand. The pain was sharp. It was like nothing Sherry had ever felt, but she was able to pull her hand out of the girl's mouth and grab onto the arm. Sherry began feeling woozy. That bite wasn't normal. She almost fell backwards, but was able to focus on grabbing the arm. Ortega then started splashing holy water from a tiny vial on the girl and speaking commandingly in Latin. The girl screamed. Then Barnes and Sherry were able to pull her off the wall. Sherry and Barnes put the girl on the bed, and Ortega continued to splash the holy water and command in Latin. The girl was still struggling, and her strength was still incredible for a person of her size. She was unfocused, though, because of Ortega's holy water and commands, so Sherry and Barnes were able to get her on the bed. "Okay, now get her arms in the restraints," Barnes said to Sherry. Sherry reached down and got the leather strap that had a padded leather cuff attached to the end. Sherry and Barnes got the girl's wrists secured. "Okay, now for the feet," Barnes continued. Ortega continued to splash the holy water and chant as Sherry and Barnes each grabbed an ankle. And despite the kicking and the struggling from the girl, they were able to get the ankles secured in the padded leather cuffs. The girl was now restrained, but Ortega kept speaking in Latin. It was different than before, though. It seemed more like he was asking the girl questions than giving her commands. The girl would talk back as if answering. This baffled Sherry. The girl was on the bed and in the straps. Why was Ortega continuing to speak in Latin? And why had this turned into a conversation? Ortega said one last thing in Latin to the girl. This last statement was said in a harsh tone. The girl's answers must have upset him. She started laughing in that guttural voice. Ortega then looked at Barnes. "Let's go, it's late." The three then exited the basement, leaving the girl strapped to the bed, laughing out loud. As Barnes and Sherry walked out of the church, Sherry looked at her watch. It was 2 a.m. They had been in that church for almost 6 hours, and it didn't feel anywhere close to that. Sherry sat down on the concrete slab that functioned as a porch, looking down, exhausted. Barnes began. "Remember that hill with the house built into the side? The bald mound." Sherry looked up at Barnes in acknowledgement of his question. Barnes continued. "I found Shine wandering around outside it one night. She was talking in that same voice you heard her using in there. She doesn't always talk like that, though. Sometimes she talks normally, but we can't understand her because she speaks some kind of Indian language. One time I had a friend of mine who teaches anthropology down at Emily Morgan University in Austin come to see her. He said that the language she uses was used by the Apache. That really doesn't make sense. There hasn't been any Apache around here in hundreds of years. They were here before the Comanche. The Comanche ran them off. Even if the Comanche hadn't run them off, how could there be one that doesn't know any English, just wandering around? Anyhow, the night I found her, she was talking in that evil voice and acting violent, just like she was down there. I was able to wrestle her to the ground and restrain her. I brought her to Ortega because she seemed possessed, like those old movies. I figured a Catholic priest would know what to do. We started calling her Shine. That was 10 years ago. She hasn't aged at all." Barnes trailed off. "I told you I'd answer questions, so do you have any?" "How often does this happen? How often does she slip from the restraints?" Sherry asked. "About once a year," Barnes answered. "And how does Ortega keep her a secret from his congregation?" "That's the funny thing. I've lived in this county my whole life, and I've never seen anyone go into this church besides priests. I think a better question is, why does the Catholic Church pay to keep the lights on in a church in a town with no Catholics?" "Maybe it has something to do with a book," Sherry asked. "A book?" "When Ortega and Shine were talking in Latin, they kept saying liber. I took Latin in college. I don't remember enough to understand what they were saying, but I know liber means book." Barnes paused, thinking, then said, "Come on, I'll give you a ride home. We're going to get back to your training tomorrow." Sherry got up from the concrete slab and followed Barnes to the pickup. The only thing she could think is, maybe a black woman with a badge isn't the strangest thing this town has ever seen. Big thank you to our fellow spooky Bill Spears for submitting his awesome story, and he tells me that this is the beginning of building a mythos that he's going to explore in many, many stories, and I've already told him that we would love to feature them on the show. Thanks again, Bill, and send in anything you create because I am proud to cultivate the world of short storytelling, at least as best I can. And speaking of cultivating short stories, I want to remind you that October is coming right up. I'm sure you're seeing the decorations in your favorite grocery store and getting amped and excited. Well, I want to give you a friendly, almost warning that there will be so much content publishing right here on Weekly Spooky in October, you will be able to stay scared possibly for months beyond. We're going to have novellas, full audiobooks, tons of new episodes, Terrifying and True, of course, Monthly Spooky, of course, Cutting Deep into Horror, of course, and so much more. I'm not joking here. At least 5 episodes a week are going to be publishing. And none of it would be possible without our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay just a little bit more to hear their names at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Bobbletopia.com, Megan Hua, Julia Kirsch, Brent McCullough, Steve King, Karen Weemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much. And if you want to join them over on Patreon and get exclusive episodes, a sneak peek at what all we have cooking here, and so very much more for as little as $1 a month, just go to weeklyspooky.com, click on Patreon, and sign up. We have almost 100 patrons. That's a goal I've been wanting for a while, so if you've been waiting, why not jump in right now? But now it's time for me to get back to work. We have so many fears to show you. So for myself, for my producer Dan Wilder, my executive producer Rob Fields, and my composer Ray Mattis, I will talk at you later. So until then, leave the demon in the basement.
Thank you for listening. Make sure to find your way back next week. But for now, you are safe. Trust me.